The various techniques I'm going to show you are wet on dry, wet on wet, and then these four are a combination of wet on dry and wet on wet in different ways. Okay, so watch along or get your paints out and paint along, even better. I thought it would be quite good to get going with a little bit of colour in my how-to videos. So I'm going to jump straight in here and we're going to paint lots of different colours and we're going to blend them into each other. So my brush is wet and I've gone straight in and put quite wet yellow on the page there. The paint is still wet. I'm going to move along the colour spectrum and I'm going to add orange and I'm putting it right next to the yellow there. So they're both wet. Now let's jump to a bit of red. So your brush is very wet and we've got some lovely intense red going on there. Now let's go and add a bit of pink, and you're touching the colour next to it, just touching it at the edge and allowing the water to bleed the colour into the colours into each other. Let's go to a bit of blue now. Just add a wee bit more blue into that. And then we'll jump to quite a vibrant green. And there we have a straightforward colour blend. We didn't really have to do very much. We just painted wet colour right next to the colour before it. Touch the colours into the previous colours and the water does the work for you. Isn't that gorgeous? So that first one there we painted straight onto dry paper, so that's called wet on dry. And now what I'm doing is I'm painting clean water onto the paper. So this is called wet on wet. So we're wetting the paper and I'm now going to get the same paint as we've already used and you can see how differently it behaves. So we'll start off with the yellow. Wash that out and then we'll move on to the orange. And then on to the red. Pink. And blue. A bit more blue. A little bit more again. And then finally the green. Such an intense green, this one. It is the phthalo green. The phthalo colours are very intense. So it bleeds a little bit further when you're painting onto wet paper. So when you're painting wet on wet, the bleeds tend to stretch that little bit further. So I'm going to just draw out a shape here and I'm going to show you a few different techniques for blending different colours. So first of all, the first one we're going to do, I'm going to do what we've just done, which is wet the area that we want to paint with clean water. And there we go, right round the whole area. And I'm going to go in and add my colour onto the wet paper. Again, this is wet in wet. Just put a wee bit more colour in there. And while it's still wet, I'm going to go in with the second colour. So I'm going to paint this half in the red. And the water pulls the colour out from where you've stopped painting. Now what you can do, if you're not very happy with the blend at the edge, take most of the water out of your brush. So you're cleaning all the colour out of your brush and most of the water, but not all of it, because if you take all of it out, it will lift the colour and act like a sponge. But if you have your brush at the same wetness as the paper, the paint on the paper, you can tease the colour to give you the kind of edge that you want. Okay, a second blending technique that you can use, I'll just draw out another shape there again, is we're not going to wet the paper with water this time. We're going to go straight in with colour. So this is called wet on dry. So the paper's dry, my brush is wet, full of paint. And paint in the shape. And while it's still wet, we're going to go back in with the second colour again. Now I can use that technique I used, where you take most of the colour and a lot of the water out of the brush and you just tease the edge to the kind of blend that you want. The water's still doing most of the work, though, most of the blending work for you. But while the paint is still wet here, we could go back in and add a third colour. It's essential that the paint is still wet and it hasn't started to dry, though. If it starts to dry, you must not do this, because otherwise you'll get what's called a bloom or a cauliflower, where the paint and the water react with each other and the water pushes the paint away and you end up with paler areas with quite hard lines around them. So there are 3 colours blended into that, and the water has done most of the work, and it turns out into a beautifully smooth blended shape. Let's do a different way of blending. So let's draw us out another shape. Now let's go for we'll put the first colour down again. And what we're going to do this time, instead of painting straight on top of the wet paint, painting our second colour on top of the wet paint, we're going to paint this first layer of colour and we're going to let it dry. So we will come back in a few minutes once that's dried. So a few minutes have passed, my paint is dry. If I touch it, it doesn't feel cold. I'm going to now re-wet the whole painted area with clean water. And I'm going to go back in with our second colour. Like so, and allow the water to do the blending again. And again, we can go back in, if we wash the colour out of our brush, take a lot of the water out of the brush, but don't go back in with a dry brush because it'll pick the colour up. It'll soak all the colour up. So you're going back in with a clean damp brush and you can manipulate the edge of the blend. If need be. So that's our third technique for blending 2 colours. And a fourth technique is, so there's our shape. We'll go and get our first colour. I'm going to paint one half of the shape with our first colour. Wash the colour out of our brush. Go in with the second colour, down at the bottom. And join them up, have them meet in the middle. Now again, you can do what we've done with a couple of the other techniques. Wash the colour out of your brush, make sure your brush is still a little bit damp, and soften the edge where the two colours met. And I'll show you, if you go in with too dry a brush, so I've taken the colour out of my brush again and I've taken most of the water out of the brush, it will soak up the colour. So you can see that there, it's actually removing the colour. So you need to make sure when you go back in that your brush still has a degree of dampness to it, a bit of water in it, the same degree of dampness as the paint is on the paper. Okay, and you can just move and soften the edge there if you need to. Okay, so that's 4 different blending techniques involving wet on wet and wet on dry. Now with the little spaces of paper I've got left, I'm going to show you just a couple of things to emphasise the different traits of wet on wet and wet on dry. So I'll take a little bit of red here on my brush and I'm just going to paint a little circle. So this is wet on dry, the paper's dry. So there we go. The paint goes where I brush it onto the paper. Next one is wet on wet. I'm going to put some wet, clean water down there and dry my brush off a little bit. Go back in and get some red paint. I'm going to draw another, paint another little circle. Do you see how that immediately spreads out with a soft edge? So that's probably the most straightforward demonstration of how paint behaves on dry paper, stays where you paint it, or on wet paper, it blends, it follows the water, it spreads out, wherever the water is, it will go. Okay, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on my video down below. And I hope I see you all at my next video. Bye.